Welcome, everyone. I'm Richard Samuels. I'm professor of political science at MIT and director of the Center for International Studies. It's barely 1 week since the inauguration of President Biden and Vice President Harris, as everyone knows, and we're all very well aware that most of our national attention has focused on things domestic in the United States: COVID, inequality, insurrection, impeachment, a whole raft of critical issues. It's a very full plate. And of course, in the meantime, the world has not stood still either. And foreign affairs have never stopped being a priority. Climate change, regional conflicts, nuclear proliferation, China's rise, the list is long, and it's growing, and it's complex. And we're here today to begin to address some of these issues. Let me just say that for the past 15 years, thanks to the vision of a generous alumnus, Robert Wilhelm, the Center for International Studies has been able to host distinguished individuals who have held senior positions in public life from the United States and from around the world. And these visitors, retired foreign ministers, one of whom's with us today, a former prime minister, retired US military commanders, other high-ranking government officials, NGO leaders, have all engaged with our faculty and with our students for up to a year each, enriching our intellectual community and the world beyond. And I'm delighted that Bob Wilhelm has zoomed in today to hear from a group of Wilhelm alumni who will share with us their views of President Biden's foreign policy challenges from the perspectives of their own countries or of the regions of their considerable expertise: India, Israel, Mexico, and China. So let me introduce to you our speakers in the order in which they'll speak, and then I'll get out of everyone's way. Lourdes Melgar, who's our first speaker, I'm delighted to report is an MIT political science PhD. She was a member of Mexico's Foreign Service from 1997 to 2005, and went on to serve as Mexico's Deputy Secretary of Energy for hydrocarbons, where she played a key role in Mexico's historic energy reform. She's a research affiliate at MIT's Center for Collective Intelligence and a non-resident fellow at the Center for Energy Studies of the Baker Institute. She also holds positions on the advisory boards of the National Resource Governance Institute, the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, and Voz Experta, an organization that promotes women experts. She was a Wilhelm Fellow from 2016 to 2017, and twice has been included on the Forbes list of the 100 most powerful women in Mexico. Naomi Chazan was our very first Wilhelm Fellow in 2004. She arrived at MIT having served as the Deputy Speaker of the Israeli Knesset. As a legislator, she championed the causes of human rights, women's rights, and consumer protection. Later, she served as president of the New Israel Fund. She's currently dean of the School of Government and Society at the Academic College of Tel Aviv-Yafo and director of the Center for the Advancement of Women in the Public Sphere at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem. She earned her BA and MA at Columbia University and her PhD at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Shivshankar Menon was a Wilhelm Fellow in the spring of 2015, having served as National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India from January 2010 to May of 2014, and previously as India's Foreign Secretary from October 2006 to August of 2009. A career diplomat, he served as Ambassador and High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, to Sri Lanka, to China, and to Pakistan. And he was also a member of India's Atomic Energy Commission and served in India's mission to the International Atomic Energy Agency. In 2010, he was chosen by Foreign Policy magazine as one of India's top 100 global thinkers. And Paul Heer is a distinguished fellow at the National Center for the Center for the National Interest. He served for 30 years in the US government, having worked as an analytic manager and member of the Central Intelligence Agency's Senior Analytics Service prior to becoming the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia, a position he held from 2007 to 2015. Dr. Heer received the CIA's Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal and the DNI's National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal as well. He earned his PhD in diplomatic history from the George Washington University and is the author of an important book in that field, Mr. X and the Pacific, George Kennan and American Policy in East Asia, which was published in 2018 by Cornell University Press. Paul was a Wilhelm Fellow at the Center in 2015 to 2016. So without further ado, let me turn this back over to Lourdes, and we look forward to everyone's remarks, and welcome back all of our Wilhelm Fellows. Thank you.
Greetings from Mexico. It is an honor to participate in this virtual Starr Forum with other Wilhelm Fellows. Thank you very much, Professor Samuels and CSIS for the invitation. And also thank you to Mr. Wilhelm for the opportunity of being a Wilhelm Fellow. As a Mexican and a former career diplomat, I am grateful that the era of Mexico bashing and wall building is over. It is refreshing to see institutions, able civil servants, diplomacy back, as well as fact-based, science-based policymaking. President Biden is most familiar with Latin America and the Caribbean. As vice president during the Obama administration, he established the foundations of cooperation for the hemisphere built around shared responsibility, respect, and partnership. He headed the high-level economic dialogue between Mexico and the United States, was the architect of a novel approach to address the deep roots of poverty, violence, and corruption in the region, particularly in Central America, oversaw the restoration of the diplomatic ties with Cuba, agreed on a global agenda with Brazil. Yet, the Trump administration destroyed most of these foundations. As expressed in President Biden's article in the Americans Quarterly in 2018, he is aware of the level of destruction done by the Trump administration and the need for US leadership to support the region in realizing its full potential. The task ahead is daunting. President Biden comes to office as the coronavirus pandemic is wreaking havoc. The Americas leads by far in terms of confirmed cases and deaths. The economic impact is setting the region back at least over a decade, with a decline on average for Latin America of GDP of around 8%, unemployment rates rising over 10%, 40 million people will join the ranks of poverty, and according to ECLAC, this is the worst crisis the region is facing in 120 years. In addition, the political landscape has changed since 2016, with the rise of populist governments, the decline of the liberal international world order, and a geopolitical reconfiguration that is redefining the balance of power at the regional level with a growing presence and influence of China and Russia. Mexico provides a case in point about how much has changed over the past 4 years and the challenges ahead for the Biden administration. The first challenge is the dissimilarities in terms of style, priorities, and values between the two heads of states. President López Obrador, a populist that arrived to power in December 2018, established a great personal relationship with Mr. Trump. He was one of the last world leaders to recognize Biden's victory in the election. And yet, on the second day in office, Biden called both his North American partners, Justin Trudeau and AMLO. With Mexico, the conversation centered on migration and on coordination to combat the COVID pandemic, which is out of control in Mexico. It is worth recalling that since 1990, Mexico and the United States have succeeded in establishing an orderly approach to address the bilateral relation. Each topic was tackled on its own merit without polluting other issues. Under the Trump administration, this was undone. 2 issues dominated the agenda and were negotiated under duress: migration and trade. In terms of migration, the most despicable chapter was written, with families being separated at the border and children being caged. Under President López Obrador, to appease Mr. Trump, Mexico became the wall, sending the Mexican National Guard to our borders to stop the flow of Central American caravans and becoming, in fact, a third safe country. On his first day in office, President Biden halted the construction of the wall and sent an immigration bill to Congress to modernize the immigration system, providing a pathway to citizenship and strengthening labor protections of migrant workers, prioritizing smart border controls, addressing root causes of migration, and supporting asylum seekers. The bill, of course, needs to become a law in the United States, but the bill touches on central elements of the bilateral relations: migration and the legal venue for 11 million of Mexican hardworking people who contribute to the US economy and society, including, of course, dreamers, and the development of Central America with the allocation of $4 billion over the next 4 years, conditioned to their ability to reduce endemic corruption, violence, and poverty. The new approach on migration will restore the respect of human rights and facilitate the search of joint solutions to a complex problem, which is likely to gain importance as the economic crisis deepens in the region. Although both presidents shared the goals of bringing development to Central America and Northern Triangle, it is unlikely that President López Obrador will support policies that he views as mingling in the internal affairs of a country. The president is particularly concerned about any US attempt to pressure Mexico on issues related to anti-corruption policies, transparency, or electoral results. President López Obrador's first and only trip abroad was to Washington, D.C. in the midst of the US electoral process to sign the USMCA, without the presence of Prime Minister Trudeau, by the way. Yet, the treaty he claims to support and is supposed to be the motor of economic recovery for Mexico and North America could become a major source of contention, as a central element is the rule of law, and the compliance with the treaty shocks with some of his policy redesign. As examples, I would mention, first of all, the changes in energy policy and the attempts to undermine North American investments, which he has been trying to do a complete overhaul of the energy reform and enacted several decrees that block the deployment of renewable energies, the dispatch of the electricity market, and basically is putting at risk billions of dollars that have been invested in Mexico. Another example is the compliance with environmental law and regulation. And here it's noteworthy that the then Senator Vice President Harris opposed the ratification of the agreement because it was not strong enough on environmental issues. The López Obrador administration is not complying even with Mexican regulation, including environmental assessment. In addition to that, I would mention the compliance with labor regulation, where USMCA grants oversight to all the other countries, and these could, in the implementation of this, could generate tensions. Climate policy, as you know, is central to the Biden presidency. President Biden signed the return of the US to the Paris Agreement. His economic recovery program is based on a clean energy revolution. This program could be the basis for boosting North America's supply chain. Yet, Mr. López Obrador has defined oil production and refining as the motors of economic development. He's actually building a new refinery in Mexico. He has blocked renewables and increased methane emissions are increasing in Mexico. Mexico will not comply with its national determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. On climate, Mexico will not be a partner, nor will other Latin American countries such as Brazil. Science and climate deniers are hallmarks of populists in the region. Bilateral cooperation on organized crime and security is likely to present challenges as well, as Mexico is taking a more nationalistic, non-interventionist approach in the area, setting limits to cooperations gained under the Emerita initiative. A close bilateral relationship based on respect, dialogue, and cooperation is most needed as both countries and the region face the COVID health and economic crisis. The US will host the Summit of the Americas in 2021. Reshaping a meaningful dialogue will be a first test for the Biden administration in the region, as more countries are leaning towards populist nationalistic governments, and there will be 10 elections in the region this year, facing severe economic crisis, social unrest, and redefining values. A failure to build bridges of understanding and mutual benefit would strengthen the possibilities of a profound geopolitical reconfiguration in the region. The US-Mexico relation will be key in defining the outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lourdes. We go now to Naomi Chazan.
Good evening, everybody. From Jerusalem, it's evening in Jerusalem. I too am absolutely delighted to be with you today. I'm especially happy that Robert Wilhelm is with us. I was the first Robert Wilhelm Fellow, and I'm eternally grateful to him and to SIS and to Dick Samuels for having me at the time and keeping me in touch with everyone at MIT. I will be looking at the issue of President Biden's foreign policy challenges from an Israeli perspective, which obviously also extends to the Middle East as well. And the problem is very clear. Foreign policy in generally, definitely as related to the Middle East, perhaps with the exception of Iran, is not a priority for the current administration at this point in time, on the one hand. On the other hand, I think you're all aware of the fact that Israel specifically and the Middle East in general have a tendency to impinge on US policy making, even at the most inopportune moments. And therefore, the question is, what are the key issues that are facing the United States at this time from the direction of Israel and the Middle East, and how can they be handled when the preference is clearly for delaying as much as possible dealing with many of these issues? I will deal with three main issues, all in Israel related, but not always directly Israel centered. And I will contend very clearly that the Biden administration will deal with caution with everything that has to relate to the area very carefully. It's a balancing act, almost walking on eggs, if you will it, with a great deal of respect on the one hand, but also a wariness built on latter-day experience with the United States. So it's really a very complex set of challenges for the United States at the moment. Let me start with the first issue. And the first issue is, how does one look at and deal with Israel today, with Israel itself? Now, I think you're all very much aware of the fact that throughout the 4 years of the Trump administration, and perhaps even the latter years of the Obama administration, there was almost no daylight between Mr. Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Mr. Trump. In a sense, they complemented each other, reinforced each other in many respects. During the Trump administration, actually, together, they made Israel a partisan political issue within the United States itself. And clearly, even though from an Israeli perspective, the United States is its most important strategic asset, in reality, there was a greater closeness between the two leaders, and not always a complementarity in the long-term interests of Israel as a state. So this is the background for the new administration. And Biden himself, like almost all presidents of the United States, is entering office with a very clear record and approach to Israel. For decades, Biden has been a champion of Israel in US politics. He has even referred to himself as an American Zionist. So he has a real and proven record of support for Israel. And that has not waned in any form or way, despite the fact that he has been belittled and offended, sometimes even rudely by Mr. Netanyahu in the past. And he finds himself in a very curious position related to Israel today. On the one hand, Jews are very prominent in the incoming administration, and staunch supporters of Israel are extremely prominent. If I mention Chuck Schumer for one, or Kamala Harris, these are just really two examples, and there are many more. On the other hand, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is much more critical of Israel and Israel's policies in recent years, and specifically of Mr. Netanyahu. So how does one begin to approach Israel? The first thing, obviously, is to look at the situation within Israel. And I don't have to remind you that Israel is about to have its fourth round of elections in less than 2 years. That's amazing, actually. It gives you some indication of the depth of the political crisis in the country. Over the past decade, Israel has undergone a process of democratic erosion. It's accelerated in the past few years. Illiberalism has skyrocketed, neo-authoritarian tendencies as well, and clearly Israel has its unique brand of populism as well. But Israel is also undergoing today, and perhaps this is less well known, a multidimensional crisis in the past year since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's not only a health crisis, and it's known most of us are getting vaccinated, already had vaccinations, but the pandemic is spiking at the same time. So there's a health crisis. There's a real economic crisis, no budget for 2 years in the country. There is great social unrest. Maybe I can concretize that by saying that Israel is a highly polarized country at the moment. I think you're familiar with that. And there are growing signs of problems of governability, inability to make decisions, and perhaps even a weakening of the state. So Mr. Netanyahu is under duress, not only because his trial starts in a couple of weeks during an election period, but also because he hasn't been able to muster a majority in the past 2 years. On the other hand, his opposition is fragmented. What does this mean? What challenge does this pose for Mr. Biden? Frankly, the Biden administration is going to have to navigate in the morass of Israeli politics when most Israelis themselves don't know how to do that. So this is issue number one. Issue number two is, very bluntly, Iran, and obviously its offshoots. Now, I think it's well known that Israel was opposed to the Iran deal of 2015. Trump exited, withdrew the United States from the JCPOA, and with the encouragement of Mr. Netanyahu, backed Israel's position against the deal in a very confrontational manner. Now, Mr. Biden is entering the White House when he clearly wants to re-examine the deal. He's aware of the need of making adjustments, and he has at his disposal in major positions old Iran hands, people who have real expertise in the ins and outs of one of the most complex deals that was made in recent memory. But he has to, in many respects, think of how to do this within a situation where Trump succeeded in cementing a Sunni conservative, some say authoritarian alliance, which spreads from the Gulf through Saudi Arabia up to North Africa. And because of the Abraham Accords with Israel, also includes Israel within this constellation. Now, what's the situation today and where does Israel stand? Frankly, since Biden's election, and Mr. Netanyahu was very slow in congratulating the incoming president, exceedingly slow. Netanyahu has made it very well known that it's important that the position on Iran not include another deal in a very confrontational manner, which was reinforced yesterday by Israel's chief of staff. Now, Mr. Biden is going to be forced, also because of European pressure and for other reasons, to deal with this issue. And although some Israeli defense experts would like a different approach, this is one issue that the path now is very confrontational. It'll be very difficult for Biden to deal with this challenge and to isolate Iran issue from Israel, if at all possible. The third issue, very quickly, is the Palestinian question. Trump very clearly backed Israel through the deal of the century, bypassed the Palestinians, and upended the sequence of what was considered the road to a solution by shunting aside the Palestinian question. Biden, however, is an avowed two-stater. He is committed to the cause, and he is going to have to roll back some of the questions that were put on the table by Mr. Trump, for example, the legality of settlements, and has already announced yesterday in the UN that he will reinstitute Palestinian representation, deal with human rights We don't know yet, but let me make it very clear, the Palestinian issue is back on the table, and Mr. Biden may find himself dealing with a new government in Israel without Bibi, which is more right-wing or Bibi's than Bibi himself. So if I wrap it up, there are three main issues and very many challenges here. The Middle East is shifting constantly, and therefore I would like to suggest that the question is no longer if the Biden administration will have to deal with these issues, but when, under what circumstances, and how. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Chazan. That was a tour de force. We appreciate it. And we move now from the Middle East on to South Asia and Ambassador Menon.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. It's a real privilege to be here with the other Robert Wilhelm Fellows, and especially when Robert Wilhelm is among us. Thank you for asking me because, who can resist the temptation to give advice to a new US administration? But in this case, we are actually, from Delhi at least, the view is of hope, of broadening relations, of moving away from some of the unpredictability and the pure made the transformation of India-US relations possible both in the Senate, in the Foreign Relations Committee, and as Vice President, he visited India. And from an Indian point of view as well, one's very happy to see old friends who have worked closely to transform India-US relations over the years. And they're now in important roles in the administration from the very top down. And that celebration of diversity, of professionalism, of articulate expertise in the appointments is something that has been welcomed across the board in India, because the transformation of the relationship over the last 2 decades has been bipartisan on both sides. So today we enter the Biden administration, the Biden era, with India-US relations in good shape. And frankly, my expectation, the general expectation here in Delhi is that it will continue to progress. It's true that Prime Minister Modi and President Trump had a relatively close relationship, but it was transactional. And in many ways, the relationship actually narrowed during the last administration. It narrowed to focus primarily on security, on defense. So, frankly, in India, everyone's looking forward to the Biden administration's stress on working with allies and partners. But the issues are not so simple because the strategic environment, Asian geopolitics, have really changed in the last few years. And the Biden presidency comes into a very different situation. Of course, the rise of China is important, and it's very important glue in the relationship to having a common view of the rise of China and its consequences. What China has done in the last year on the border has actually led India-China relations into crisis. And that is something which both sides have actually worked together on. But there is more to India-US relations than China. There are a whole host of other issues in the Indo-Pacific, for instance, where the Quad has been resurrected. It was last there in 2007, 2008, and where in the maritime space, all the way from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of the US, there is a very close congruence of strategic interests. But there are issues which are left over, which I'm not sure how these are going to be dealt with. For instance, Russia is important to India's continental strategy in Asia, just as Iran is. And CATSA, the Countering America's Adversary. So we have to see how we actually deal with this. On Iran, with a welcome some calming of the opportunities with the Biden administration coming in energy, climate change, for instance. There are tremendous opportunities in solar and renewables, LNG, and so on. Global health is the other area where, frankly, both countries should do much more. From our point of view, of course, vaccines, meds for COVID are clearly a global public good. And I wonder whether we have the moral courage or the spine to actually waive IPRs on COVID-19 vaccines and medicines as we did for HIV/AIDS. Another area where there's actually tremendous open internet to actually work on digital architecture together. But this is an unstable area, and we have to see how we progress this. And when I look down the road, the most uncertainty in my mind attaches to the economic relationship, both the bilateral and the multilateral. Protectionist sentiment in both countries has been rising since the economic shock of the pandemic, and even from before, when the economy was undergoing a slowdown. The stress in India has been increasingly on self-reliance. And this is true not only of India, it's true of China, it's true of the US, on the stress on building the domestic economy, and in fact, a fundamental rebalancing of the domestic political economy in all our countries. And I'm not clear at all where this will end, how far the Biden administration get back in the WTO, for instance. There could be clouds on the horizon, is actually was barely discussed even. It seems to me that both societies are challenged in this respect today, and both have a lot of work to do at home, and actually should be working together to strengthen democracy and deal with differences democratically. But that might be just my optimism speaking. So where do I think, when you broaden the lens a bit, where do I think we might be going? It seems to me that, we've seen some shift in terminology on the Indo-Pacific, for instance, from free and open to secure and prosperous. For me, frankly, the terminology is less important than actually creating a quad plus, getting others like Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, others to actually work on a secure and prosperous Indo-Pacific. Maritime Asia is the heart of India-US convergence, and I think we need to build that. But it does worry me that we cannot run an active political, military, security cooperation without an economic leg to stand on. And for both of us to turn inwards, economic, COVID has accelerated that. So today we have a new situation that requires a new strategy and a new strategic logic. So I think I would await the policy reviews. The world is between orders, and the temptation to restore a so-called liberal international order would be a mistake to my mind, because you can't rewind the clock at a time when, frankly, great power rivalry is higher than it ever was. I think Paul will probably speak about China-US relations. I have a slightly broader concern also. We are watching a restoration, and with all that means. And vengeance, revenge, dividing people. And fortunately, has avoided the trap of letting their predecessors set the agenda. And I do hope that this goes on, not just domestically, but externally as well. So 2 last quick points. China is significant, but not the answer to all the problems and priorities, because even a China-US G2 cannot solve the political and security issues in Asia, whether it's the Senkakus, whether it's or other powers do matter. Administration in the US will work in order to improve our future from the purely transactional dog-eat-dog world that we were promised before. I'll stop there and give you back the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's clear to me that we should have scheduled 4 separate Starr forums, because each one of these presentations deserves further digging and attention and engagement. Perhaps we'll take a rain check with each of you on that. Paul here is going to talk to us about U.S.-China relations under the Biden administration and what to expect. Paul?
Yes, thank you, Dick. Well, like the other panelists, I'm delighted to have been invited to participate here. I'm certainly immensely grateful to Robert Wilhelm for his original sponsorship for the fellowship, and to you, Dick, for the invitation to join the team 5 or 6 years ago. So it's a great thrill to be here with my fellows. With regard to East Asia, I think that President Biden has a lot of repair and restoration work to do in that region. I think this has been alluded to by some of the other panelists as well. This is because, in my view, the Trump presidency has seriously degraded the U.S. role in the region. Although Beijing shares a lot of the responsibility here, I think Trump helped Beijing to escalate the most hostile and confrontational U.S.-China relationship we've seen in really 50 years. And I think more importantly, or as importantly, he did so while undermining confidence in the reliability and credibility of the United States among our allies and partners, the same allies and partners that Biden is going to need to rely on in dealing with China. And I would note that this trend predated the Trump administration. There were a lot of countries in the region that had already started to reassess their policies in the wake of shifts in the regional balance of power, and frankly, because of their concerns about the substance and sustainability of Washington's attention to the region and commitment to the region. But Trump, I think, exacerbated this with his, what others have called his race to the bottom with Beijing, and his inconsistent and I think, frankly, sometimes reckless approach to U.S. allies. I think that Biden is going to revive a more pragmatic and more attentive and more realistic posture toward the Asia Pacific. I think Biden himself and many of the members of his foreign policy team, especially Secretary of State, confirmed yesterday, Tony Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and East Asia, or I guess Indo-Pacific Policy Coordinator Kurt Campbell, who's assuming a new position. All of these people have long experience and familiarity with the region from their work in the Obama administration and earlier in their careers. But I think they also know that they can't simply revert to Obama era or Obama administration policies, that the region has changed dramatically in the past 4 years in ways that, and Ambassador Menon just mentioned this, in ways that will require new strategies and tactics. And I think, frankly, probably some reassessment of U.S. interests and goals and aspirations in the region. But this is going to take time, primarily because Biden is obviously going to need to focus on really urgent domestic priorities like reining in the COVID pandemic here and dealing with the deep political divisions that fueled the events, the constitutional crisis really of the 6th of January. At the same time, I think we should not expect that Biden is going to immediately reverse all of Trump's East Asia policy initiatives, nor is that necessarily going to be his instinct. I think, for example, domestic politics are bound to influence how quickly he's going to be able to defuse the trade war with China and lift the tariffs, just as one example. But and I think that before the Biden administration starts making any concessions to China, he's going to be looking for indications of what reciprocal concessions might be forthcoming from the Chinese side. One question I have is how constrained Biden is going to feel by domestic politics from moving toward a more constructive relationship with China, which we clearly would like to see on both sides. He's certainly going to be under pressure not to appear weak, given the political context of the China policy debate over the last couple of years. And he's going to be looking for bipartisan support on Capitol Hill, which I think is going to help set the parameters of the way he approaches China in the region. I think in any event, Biden is definitely not going to be retreating to a posture of complacency about China, not that we ever had one, or simply a return to engagement, which has been much debated. There's been way too much water under the bridge for that. During his presidential campaign, as many candidates often do, President Biden, then candidate Biden, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs in which he acknowledged that the United States does need to get tough with China because of Beijing's competitive challenge to the United States and its allies, because of the many aggressive and coercive and covert elements of that challenge, and because of China's efforts to internationally promote and legitimize its model of governance and development, its authoritarian socialist model. And Tony Blinken, just last week, I think during his confirmation hearings, said similar things. In fact, he specifically said that he agreed with the Trump administration that China merits a strong U.S. response, although he did quite clearly specify that he disagreed with a lot of the tactics that the Trump administration had used. So although I think that Biden and his team have made it clear that they recognize the need for and will pursue cooperation with Beijing on global issues of transnational issues of concern, like climate change and global health and global economic crises. They're not going to do so at the expense of confronting China on many other issues. And in fact, Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell, in their own article in Foreign Affairs shortly before Biden's own, wrote that they thought that the best approach to Beijing would be, quoting here, will be to lead with competition and follow with offers of cooperation. I think, interestingly, in terms of the bottom line, in the same article, Campbell and Sullivan, as an indicator of where they're going to be coming from, outlined what they called a policy of managed coexistence and sustained competition with China. And they based this in part on an acknowledgement that China and the United States, quoting here again, each will need to be prepared to live with the other as a major power. And they also acknowledged the need for what they called humility about, just a final quote again, humility about the capacity of decisions made in Washington to determine the direction of long-term developments in Beijing. Now, I think this was a very positive indication of the Biden team's recognition of the need for a reciprocal approach to China that doesn't overestimate U.S. leverage over China. But Campbell and Sullivan also framed their goal as coexistence with China on terms favorable to U.S. interests and values. Now, this obviously makes sense too, U.S. interests and values and the interests and values of our allies. But the key challenge here, I think, is going to be competing with what will inevitably be Beijing's pursuit of terms favorable to Chinese interests and values, without letting this contest evolve into a zero-sum struggle for regional supremacy. I think the best news for the region is that Biden and his team, Ambassador Manning particularly mentioned this, have also been emphatic and consistent about their determination to reinvigorate and reinvest in America's alliances and partnerships in the region. And I think this is frankly going to be vital to mending the damage that has been done by Trump's inattention and neglect and even abuse of the allies on occasion. And Biden and Sullivan and Campbell have all written and spoken about this, starting in the articles they published last year and in the comments since. They've talked a lot about the importance of renewing attention to coalition alliance politics Biden had written that this would give us substantial leverage to shape the rules of the road. And in the article that Campbell and Sullivan wrote, they thought that this would help shape China's choices. And I find this, as I think a lot of allies do, very reassuring. But it's not going to be easy because there's a lot of ground to recover, I think, even before that ground can be reinforced. Partly because, in addition to eroding the region's confidence in the United States, I think the Trump presidency, unfortunately, has eroded the example of American democracy that has always been a core element of Washington's pursuit of shared values and goals with its allies and partners in the regions. And Biden has already acknowledged about the need to, what he said, salvage our reputation. But I'm kind of returning to where I started. I think this is only the first step toward rebuilding confidence in Washington's attention to East Asia and commitment there. Because unfortunately, I think the cumulative impact of the past several years has also been greater uncertainty in the region about our reliability, about our economic competitiveness there, and even our military preparedness there. And I guess my last thought, I think that addressing these concerns among allies and partners is going to require Washington to have a more accurate and up-to-date understanding of the varying interests and priorities and threat perceptions of those allies, which is one of the other things I believe that's eroded over the past several years. The United States needs to avoid the risks of taking the allies for granted, presuming that their ideas on how best to deal with China are always going to be the same as Washington's, or obliging them to choose sides between Beijing and Washington, which we keep hearing they don't want to do. And this is because, I guess, my perspective as a historian. Over the past 4 years, many of our friends in East Asia have adapted. And again, Ambassador Menon referred to this, to a new regional security dynamic and an economic and even military balance of power. So I don't think that Washington or the Biden administration are going to be able to just catch up where we left off 4 years ago. Washington needs to work closely with its allies and its partners to fully understand where the United States now fits in this new balance of power, and to use that foundation of understanding for a renewal of American leadership in the region. And the good news, I guess, and I'll end with this, is that I think the Biden team is fully aware of the nature and scope of this challenge, and they're ready to confront it. So I'll just conclude by saying at this point, I'm optimistic. So thanks.
Thanks very much, Paul. What a terrific array of presentations we've had. And we can turn now to the questions. I want to seize the prerogative of the chair, though, before we turn to the questions. And there are a number of interesting ones that have already been submitted. But this being MIT, I suspect that many in our audience have a special interest in hearing from each of you what you think the prospects are for technological cooperation between these countries and the United States, and how that may or may not be a change from the Trump years. So there was that question was sort of stimulated by something that Paul just said, quoting from, I guess it was the Campbell-Sullivan piece, lead with competition, follow with cooperation in the case of our relations with China. But you know, each one of these countries, Mexico, Israel, India, and China, have a complex technological relationship with the United States. I wonder if you could speak to how that might or might not change going forward in the country with which you're most familiar. Who wants to start?
Well, I can start with one comment. I mean, I think the S&T issue is a central, in fact, arguably one of the central challenges facing the U.S.-China competition. China is not the Soviet Union. It poses a much more broad-based and comprehensive and profound challenge to the United States than the Soviet Union ever did. And I think that's partly because and I think the main thrust of that challenge is in the economic and S&T sphere. So I think that what the Biden administration is going to have to confront, and the Trump administration started to confront this, is this tension between the win-win potential for science and technological cooperation and the national security implications, because the Chinese are highly competitive in this regard. And I think that the move for decoupling that emerged out of the Trump administration to kind of decouple the United States economically and technologically to the extent that it's possible or feasible or advisable from China will move forward, because there are legitimate national security concerns about how China wields power, technology, and how it uses technological mechanisms for, to pursue its national interests, which are highly competitive against ours. But I think that we're still trying to figure out how to array that defense without going overboard, because, as you know, there's been a lot of side effects of that in terms of hampering of academic cooperation. I mean, MIT is a very recent recipient of some of the tensions that this has been generated. So I think that, I guess I would just reaffirm your point that technology is going to be a huge element of the strategic competition we see now. But there are costs and benefits, and I think it's going to be a particularly difficult challenge to see how we can address the national security implications of that competition without letting it lead to a bifurcation of the global economy and the global S&T sector, which obviously has potential for mutual benefits for all the countries in the world, including the United States and China together.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah,
Ambassador Menon?
Yeah, just to add to that, technology has always been a big driver of the India-US relationship, even when it was politically complicated. And right from the Green Revolution in the 60s, I mean, India is able to feed herself because of US technology in agriculture. And today, there's huge opportunities, it seems to me, in the digital space, in cyberspace. The problem here is that increasingly governments have looked at cyberspace as a national security issue rather than as a pure technology issue. And the last thing from an Indian point of view that we would like to see is a decoupling or a fragmentation of these open spaces, of cyberspace, of the new domains, frankly, whether it's maritime or cyber or any of these domains. And I think that's already happened in the internet. It's the assertions of sovereignty, the Great Firewall, etc. But as far as India-US cooperation in technology is concerned, I think that's been a consistent driver of the relationship right through. And at the level of people, but also much more systemically as well, in terms of our approach to desiring a multi-stakeholder global web, basically. But we are going to deal with what happens between the US and China on technology. I mean, for me, this is an area where the US and China are codependent, as well as, being rivals. So some rebalancing, I think, is necessary from maybe the Trump administration approach. But I think it's something that India will watch very, very closely.
Thank you very much. Lourdes, did I see your hand go up?
Yeah, I was thinking how to answer this question, because I think it's obvious that through the period of NAFTA and up to 2018, there was a convergence in terms of technology and not only the technology that is used in Mexico, but in terms of the training of people and the work together that we have with US national labs and all of that. The issue right now is that President López Obrador has been questioning what he calls neoliberal science and neoliberal technology. And so there has been an effort to undermine a lot of the work and the agreements that have been done in the past. He has basically defunded many of the research projects that were being undertaken in Mexico, including modifying policies so that research centers cannot receive funds from other sources from abroad. And so this is really sort of a red flag that I think perhaps most people in the US are not seeing yet. I mean, the private sector, of course, works closely and, you know, is focused more on that US technology and you know, but it is an issue, and it is an issue also because there is greater interest on behalf of China and of Russia of having a presence here in Mexico. And we are seeing this, it's not exactly technology, but it's the vaccine issue. We were supposed to be getting the Moderna vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, everything. And in the end, this Monday, President Lopez Obrador spoke with Vladimir Putin, and they agreed that Mexico is going to buy 24 million of the Sputnik vaccine, which this is creating a lot of debate here in Mexico. But it's a clear sign that he's turning his back to what have been our traditional solutions or alliances or of cooperation and looking for new ones.
Dr. Chazan, Israel is the high-tech nation, we're told. How do you respond to the question?
We're a mixture of very high-tech and very low-tech. 3 points. Number one, Israeli high-tech and technology and technological relations with the United States are long-standing, cutting edge in a lot of areas, but lately very strongly in areas of cybersecurity, and military matters as well. That's going to continue. I don't see any signs of a change or shift in that area, and that's point number one. Point number two, and I think in one way or another, all the panelists alluded to it, is that what has changed is that the direct US, in my case, Israel connection is no longer exclusive. And I think it's worthwhile to look at the relations, for example, between Israel and other countries and China. China is heavily invested in Israel at the moment. It's invested, by the way, throughout the Middle East. Russia, which was not mentioned once almost, except perhaps by Paul, is also heavily invested, and Israel has direct relations with Russia as well, mostly on a tactical military level, but they are not unimportant. So even though the relationship with the United States, I anticipate to be strong and continue to be strong, it's no longer exclusive. And I think that's the big shift that has occurred in the past few years. And the third point, I'd like to bring in one other topic. Technology and technological cooperation, in the case of the Biden administration, comes together with the resurrection of human rights on the global level as well. And therefore, it'd be intriguing to see what the connection is between technological cooperation and human rights.
That takes us, thank you very much. And it's a perfect segue to a question that Professor Oy has posted up here. It says that the question's been answered live, but I'm not sure it's been shared with the entire audience. So let me ask it, I'll read it. It speaks to exactly this point. He says, the COVID vaccine access is now high politics. Israel's domestic vaccines program is the best in the world, but Palestinians on the West Bank complain that Israel has cut off access to vaccines. The Serum Institute of India is playing a major role in meeting the needs of India and neighboring nations, except Pakistan. So the question he asks is, should Israel and India balance humanitarian, or how should Israel and India balance humanitarian and ethical concerns with other interests with respect to the West Bank and Pakistan? Not an easy question, but a smart one. Thanks, Ken.
On Pakistan,
I
may
jump
I?
in, or Ambassador, Mr.
After
Menon?
you. After you.
Uh, let me say that I really appreciate Kenoy's question in regards to him as well. I appreciate it because he has refocused attention on something very important. If Trump tried and Netanyahu to push the Palestinian off the table, I think it's very important to just state that the Palestinian issue is back on the table and it's going to have to be dealt with. And even though it's correct, on inoculations against the COVID pandemic, Israel is way ahead of everybody else. But I want to stress also that the number of cases is spiking as well. So we're caught somewhere in the dilemma. It's not very clear how long we'll be able to have to balance this and when we'll be able to emerge from the problem. Direct answer to Ken's question. It is absolutely absurd, in my opinion, to think that one could or should withhold vaccinations from the Palestinians. If there's one thing we've all learned during the past year, it's that if you're next to each other, you're going to, in one way or another, pass on the virus to each other. And it shows the proximity between Israelis and Palestinians. There is a big movement in Israel now to make sure that Israel does provide the vaccinations, first for health reasons of everybody involved, and secondly, for pure humanitarian reasons. This can create a basis for perhaps more positive engagement between Israel and Palestine as well. So the assumption behind the question is something that I personally totally support, but many Israelis do for perhaps other reasons as well.
Thanks. Ambassador Menon?
With Pakistan, the initial signs were good that the pandemic would actually force us into working together. Prime Minister Modi called a summit with all the other South Asian countries online, and they did agree on some steps that would be taken. On the vaccinations, yes, India supplied vaccines to all the other neighbors, except China, which didn't want them, said they had their own, and to Pakistan. Pakistan can still access them, but I do think that politics in both countries, internal politics, actually prevents this. Today, we're in a situation where some control level of hostility seems to suit both regimes, or at least the power holders in both countries, for their own reasons. And so it's unlikely, but Pakistan could access vaccines made in India through the WHO if you wanted to. And there is an open offer, which is open to everyone, actually, for the vaccines. But now, of course, she'd have to join a line, and the line is just growing longer and longer, unfortunately.
Thank you. Well, here's a question about U.S. interventions and U.S. diplomacy. It's been touched upon in bits and pieces in the commentary, so forth. The U.S. role in Central America, something that Dr. Melgar spoke to. She's already addressed that. And Dr. Chazan addressed the strategic role of the Biden administration in the broader Middle East, but focused on Iran. For Ambassador Menon and Dr. Heer, there's something to ask about that really didn't come up in the discussion, which is that India and China have a simmering confrontation along a 2,000-mile long disputed border in the Himalayas. So the question is, what, if any, is the role each country would like the Biden administration, or put differently, would expect the Biden administration to play, if any, presumably to help de-escalate tensions, and specifically, would a U.S. role that comes packaged inside a strengthening of the Quad, that includes Australia and Japan, along with other countries that Ambassador Menon mentioned, along with India, of course. Would that make things better or worse?
Well, it seems to me that neither India nor China has actually asked other countries to intervene beyond verbal expressions of support. President Trump's immediate reaction was to offer to, this was in spring this year. I mean, the Chinese immediately rejected it. We just kept quiet. So it's hard to say that there's a direct American role in trying to settle the crisis. This is an old crisis, and this problem on the border has gone on for a long time. In a sense, too proud. But the other problem is, of course, that the US is cutting down on her engagement in mainland Asia. Has less and less of a commercial presence in Eurasia. And it's in the maritime sphere that we've worked together. Now, the US has helped to strengthen India, both in terms of our capability to know what's happening on the land borders, but also in terms of our military reforms, which are still going on right now. So that, I think, will be strengthened and will continue. But a diplomatic role, I find that hard to anticipate. And that also, I'm not sure that given the state of China-US relations, that could be a very helpful or positive development.
Thank you. Paul, did you want to weigh in?
Well, sure. I mean, you're just taking off of Ambassador Menon's final point. I mean, I think it goes without saying that Beijing doesn't believe that the United States has any role to play in its border dispute with India. And I think he was right to emphasize that, you know, an offer for us to mediate would not necessarily be welcomed by either party, might be problematic. And I think Washington is obviously more sympathetic to the Indian perspective because we frankly see China as the more assertive and more expansionist, if you will, party. But the facts on the ground are always going to be confusing and subject to debate, which is a persistent part of the equation. So I think even though we're sympathetic to the pressures that the Indians face from China in that regard, it's not one where I think that we could usefully play a diplomatic role. I mean, you asked about, you know, where this fits into the greater context of the Quad, and I think there was another question maybe that was related to that. I mean, there are, I think one of the constraints on the Quad, you know, especially including or in terms of expanding its membership, is that one of the things that has kind of slowed the pace and scope of cooperation of the existing Quad is. I think two things. It's not clear that there is a firm consensus on what the threat perceptions are and how best to deal with it, because particularly when you talk about expanding its membership, there is a range of views as to how confrontational the Quad and any expanded version of it should be in terms of dealing with China, whether it should be explicitly viewed as or implicitly viewed as targeting China. And I think, frankly, one of the other constraints has been, even under the original four members, there is a range of levels of mutual confidence in each other and their diplomatic assertiveness. And I think that expanding the membership is only going to add to that issue. I mean, I think, you know, the concept is a good one, but it's the challenge is how to pursue it without making it look to the Chinese like it's a containment alliance.
Thanks. I had thought that we had covered an enormously wide swath of the globe, but I see a very interesting question that raises an issue for us to consider that hadn't come up. And or it had come up only marginally, and that's from an anonymous attendee who asks, how will the new Silk Road, I presume that's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, how will the new Silk Road and the Russian access in the Arctic for maritime access alter how we normally, our normal global balance, economy, climate, technology, and so forth? In other words, well, I don't have to put it in other words. What do you think of that? This is an area that we haven't addressed, but is an important one for us to consider, it seems to me.
Well, I'll just interject a couple of thoughts here. I mean, there's two different issues here, and I guess they're related. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is one part of it, but the Arctic goes off on a somewhat different tangent. There's a couple overlapping issues there, but I guess the one point I would make about the Belt and Road Initiative is that I think it is generally seen, and I think accurately, by most of the rest of the world as an effort by Beijing to extend and expand its geo-economic and geostrategic influence. I don't think it adds up to a pursuit of global hegemony. That's a separate issue we can get to. But I think that the biggest challenge that, certainly from the US perspective, that we've faced is how to deal with it. I think we have to make sure that we have an accurate understanding of what its intentions are. But I guess my bottom line, and Evan Feigenbaum and others have written about this, is that I think the response, certainly to whatever extent the United States is going to provide leadership in a response, is to compete and not just complain. Of a lot of the countries that China is targeting for investment in infrastructure projects and loans and such are not seeing viable or substantial alternatives being offered by other countries, including the United States. So I think it's just part of this broader geostrategic competition. And I think we need to get back on the playing field rather than, I mean, and there are certainly faults to be found about the way the Chinese conduct business with their transparency and different elements of the deals that they make. But that's the point I would make about the Belt and Road Initiative. But the Arctic is another issue, and I'm not sure exactly how the question framed it is similar to that. But one observation I would make is that is one of the areas where there is a fault line between Beijing and Moscow. I mean, there's a lot of commentary and analysis and presumptions about the challenge that the U.S. and the rest of the world, and the U.S. and its allies and partners face from the new Sino-Russian axis, and there are a lot of challenges there because they share some strategic goals that are in competition with those of the U.S. and its allies. But I think it's easy to overlook and underestimate the potential fault lines there in terms of they have competing spheres of influence in Central Asia. And I think they have potentially competing spheres of influence or interest in the Arctic as well.
Thanks.
May I just add to that?
Yeah, please.
I think Paul is absolutely right. Belt and Road, I think, is very different from the Arctic. I think Belt and Road, especially in Central Asia, is an attempt to consolidate the Eurasian heartland, as it were. But it has a whole series of challenges, whether it will make money and pay for itself, goes through some of the most unstable regions, both in terms of security and politics. And it is an area where there are regional powers, Iran and the others, who ultimately are not going to take kindly to a dilution of their influence in what they see as their traditional backyards, including the Russians. But I think in order to deal with it, it's not enough for the US to just compete. I think the US should also stop pushing the Russians into the Chinese arms. That's something I've never really understood, because the consequences of what happens in Europe in today's geopolitics, and given the Belt and Road and so on, actually are felt at the other end of the continent, or the Asian continent. So I think there is a case there for actually a serious review of how to deal with Russia. If if the US is interested in a role on mainland Asia. But I'm not sure how much stomach there is for that politically. And that's true of all of us. It's true of India. There's much less interest in being involved in the rest of the world after these triple shocks of the pandemic, the economic crash, and, well, domestic politics, which are increasingly polarized and fractious.
Thank you. Lourdes.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to make a comment from the view from Latin America, because I think it is really important that the US doesn't continue to look at Latin America as basically its backyard. The world has become much smaller, and I think China and Russia are really becoming very active in the region. China is doing important investments in different countries. They've been able to switch around support from countries that had bilateral relationships with Taiwan, now having them just with China. And they are really eager to get the resources that, the mineral resources that are in the region. And on the other hand, there is this big ideological divide right now. Our societies are divided just as any other, where people are looking at other ideologies and they are leaning very much towards more authoritarian populist regimes, where a country such as Russia is being attractive. So it seems to me that there is an urgent need to not think that because there has been a close relationship with Latin America and a presence, that this will basically prevail. The China and Russia are being very aggressive in their approach and very supportive of the populist regimes in the region.
Thanks. Naomi.
Just three very short points. Number one, I think there's a very close correlation between the areas of confrontation or competition between China, Russia, the United States. By the way, Turkey in certain areas as well, some regional powers, and domestic fragility in particular countries in the region. And the domestic fragility is very important because most of the states involved are authoritarian states with very active publics that do not always accept the authorities in charge. So the fragility of the states is a key contributor to what's going on. That's point number one. Point number two, what we're talking about, without saying it, is a global reordering. But what's missing in this global reordering is what the linking concept is. In the post-World War II order, it was very clear what the principles are. Today, it's not yet explicit, and I think that's a major challenge for everybody involved. And the final point is that in one way or another, certain areas of activity do form a possible focus for consolidation. I saw Robert Wilhelm ask a very important question on climate change, which affects in one way or another everybody. And if principles around that can achieve some kind of global consensus, it can be a trigger for the kind of rebalancing that we're talking about. So some thoughts on the basis of the discussion.
Thanks, and thanks for calling my attention to Bob's question, which I hadn't seen, and for which I apologize. We've run out of time, but let's take this for those of you who want to respond. I'm guessing that Lourdes would want to respond for sure. The question is, a key element of Biden's campaign was major emphasis on climate change. China, India, and Mexico seem to be on a different path. on different paths with increasing hydrocarbon use and production, how will those countries react to US policies on climate change?
Well, I think it's
yeah, go ahead.
Well, Lourdes, why don't you do it, and then we'll shift to Ambassador.
Great. I think it's a great question, because what we have seen is that even though there is a general agreement about the need to address climate change, there is a significant backlash in terms of advancing in the energy transition, with particularly populist governments supporting the development of fossil fuels and coal. And so I think there will be a need to find a much more creative way of linking climate policy with the development in the region and the opportunities for people, job creation, and how the losers of the transition are going to be made up. And I think this is a very important challenge that in the specific case of Mexico, it's very difficult to find a level of conversation, because oil is linked to nationalism, to national sovereignty, and it's sort of trying to have a discussion on this issue is basically a non-starter. And I think similar thing happens, for instance, in Poland, where it's not oil, but it's coal, and you start going one-on-one. Brazil has a sovereignty issue regarding the Amazon, and it's really a new type of discussion that we have to begin. A lot of creativity will be needed.
Ambassador Menon, I'll give you the final word.
Ooh, I'm not sure I want that. On climate change, it's interesting because the Modi government has actually set much more ambitious targets than any previous Indian government. That doesn't mean that we're going to abandon coal right away, because that's one thing we have. Everything else is important: gas, oil, etc. And nuclear still has to step up and fill the breach. But on renewables, on solar especially, wind, actually we have very ambitious targets. And it seems to me this is an opportunity for India to actually work with the US to try and do something. But the key here is technology. Whether it's in terms of mobility, on transport, whether it's in terms of battery storage, all of which has actually brought the cost of renewables in India down to remarkable levels. I mean, they're actually competitive with fossil fuels. But there is an element, I think, of creative accounting, perhaps, in some of that. But I do think that this is a huge opportunity, and I'm so glad you asked that question, because as Lourdes said, we have to think about this differently. And if we do apply and actually spread the technologies, I think there's so much more we can do. The reason I'm an optimist in India is because, frankly, we are now facing really bad air, water, soil. And it's starting to affect people's health in the cities. Delhi is one of the most polluted in terms of air pollution. And that middle-class discontent is going to drive the government, whether through the courts or through various other ways, or elections. It's going to drive the government to starting to do much more. So we are at a good moment, actually, for US activism on climate change. Thank you.
Well, this conversation could continue on into the night. I'm not just talking about the night in Delhi and the night in Jerusalem, but our night as well. And it would be very productive and a lot of fun, but we can't do that. So I want to thank again our Wilhelm Fellows for coming back to MIT, at least virtually. You're always welcome to come back to MIT in reality, and for producing such a stimulating conversation. Thank you all very much. And thanks everyone for attending.